Thanks, everyone. Hello. So my name is Jonathan Mahoney. I'm the Vice President of Online Learning for GRAMMY Go. GRAMMY Go is the Recording Academy's first creator-to-creator platform, which puts you in front of industry professionals, Grammy winners and nominees, and essentially is meant to prepare you for the industry. So we just launched our first ever course on Wednesday via Coursera. It's called Building Your Audience for Music Professionals. It's taught by Joey Harris, who got his come up with Janet Jackson. He's been in the industry for 20 years doing music marketing. We feature perspectives from Victoria Monet, you all know, Janelle Monáe, and also Jimmy Jam, who has 41 top 10 hits and is an industry icon. And it's live on Coursera right now. We've got flyers all around the back. Please take a look. We'd love for you to take a peek. So now on to why you're actually here. For this panel, Sounds of the Stage, our moderator is Thomas Winkler, who is head of publisher, songwriter, and society relations at Amazon Music. With over 12 years of experience representing global talent and record labels, we're really lucky to have Thomas here. I was just chatting with Thomas beforehand. It's pretty amazing how much he has going on. So please welcome Thomas Winkler.
What's up, y'all? How y'all doing? Grammy and everyone watching at home, my name is Tom, and we'll be moderating the conversation today. So I lead songwriting and publisher relations at Amazon Music. Prior to Amazon, I worked at the intersection of A&R, talent management, brand partnership, and creative direction and production. So you all ready to get started? We'll introduce our panelists. So, pleasure of introducing David Lai, music director and the co-founder of Park Avenue Artists. Next, we have Kurt Deutsch, the SVP at Warner Music Entertainment and Theatrical Ventures. He just had Notebook open up this week, last month on Broadway. Last but not least, Kathy Sommer, music conductor, composer, producer, who has many credits on Broadway, including shows like Beauty and the Beast. So today we're going to dive into audio, songwriting, music making, composition at the intersection of Broadway and how that transcends Broadway into commercial music. I'll start with questions that are broad, and then we'll narrow in and then get broad again and open up the floor for some questions. So first question, David, you want to start us off? How did you get started in the field?
Well, I guess it's, I originally started out as a musician, grew up playing the piano and was very serious and thought I would actually do that as a career. But it became pretty clear at a certain point that I was not good enough to be a solo classical musician. So I started to do musical theater in high school, sort of put it aside after college to focus on like a real career. But then I got sucked into playing for Broadway shows and fell in love with that. And so from that, it ended up leading me towards the record industry. So I wanted to do the live music, but I also wanted to be able to do the business side. So I started to get involved in that. And ultimately, I've had a career conducting. I worked at Phantom for many years as a conductor, and worked at Sony Music in A&R, and I think that's how we met, perhaps, is through the record business. And then I have an artist management company. So for me, my whole life has always revolved around music and helping people do it, because I always selfishly wanted to work with the best, because I knew I couldn't be the best, but I had good enough ears that I thought I could help people. And so that's how I've ended up doing what I'm doing.
Cool, thanks. One quick question. Tell me a little bit about the intersection of like A&R at a record label and conducting or MDing music on Broadway.
I don't know if there's a direct connection between the conducting and the A&R side. Certainly, A&R and the management side, there's a lot of overlap, especially given that the industry has evolved over time. Management, I think, more and more these days is involved in helping their artists develop and getting to the point where then a major label can actually amplify what they're doing. I think the old days of where labels would get in the trenches of developing an artist is not as much as it used to be. So that's, for me, that ties very much into my interest as a musician. The conducting and the being involved as a performer is more that side of it. I enjoy doing that. but I can't say there's a direct correlation.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Kurt, how did you get started in the field?
How much time do we have?
I feel you.
I grew up in St. Louis, which is where you're from. I was an actor for about 25 years or so. Did a lot of bad television and some Broadway, and moved back in '98. And I moved back to New York from LA in '98, and I started. I did my Sex and the City and my Law and Order, and then in the year 2000, I said, hey, maybe I should start a record label, which was kind of crazy because I was married to a woman who was an actress on Broadway named Sherry Renee Scott, and I looked at a contract that a record label had given her, and I was like, this doesn't really seem fair, and so it was kind of right after Rent had opened, and there was this whole new generation of Broadway performers who were interested in bridging the gap between rock and roll and theater, like Sherry and Alice Ripley and Adam Pascal and the Broadway Inspirational Voices, and so I created a company called Shikaboom Records, and Shikaboom was the sole reason was really to create a united artists for Broadway. And then a few years later, I started something called Ghostlight Records, which was a label dedicated to cast recordings. And so, I guess since 2002 to now, I've basically produced over 200 Broadway and off-Broadway cast recordings, as well as albums by Broadway artists, and then most recently, over the past few years, I've been developing musicals, and the first musical that I've developed for Broadway opened March 14th. It's called The Notebook, and the album came out yesterday by Ingrid Michaelson, and so, anyway, that's the short story.
Thanks, Kurt. Kathy.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. So I started out also as a classical pianist and studied at Yale University and thought I was going to go that route, and then, but also had all this background in commercial music and jazz, and my dad was an amazing drummer, and he worked in Latin jazz, and my mom was a big band singer. So I had all these other elements going on, and I also loved theater. So fast forward to when I moved to New York, and I was in the BMI workshop as a composer. Actually, I did that while I was still at Yale. And then, so that got me interested in writing at the same time. And then I started playing auditions and playing rehearsal piano and getting involved in shows. And my first show was doing Cats as a rehearsal pianist, and then I ended up back there as a conductor years later. And then I went on to City of Angels and Romance, Romance, where I was a music director and arranger and conductor. And we got into other TV iterations of that. And I started getting interested in record making and recording when I was a music director for that album. Then fast forward to sort of the second half of my career, which is when I started getting, during Beauty and the Beast, which was after City of Angels, I started getting interested in songwriting and had always pursued that, even in college. I studied actually with Maury Yeston, who is a Broadway composer, and that was my first introduction to that. So when I started getting serious about it, I got a publisher to work with me and had access to some major records and ended up on some of the big rock albums, Daughtry, and he was an American Idol finalist, and then Hailstorm and Shinedown, and wrote with a bunch of rock bands, and still do that to this day. So now I have this very eclectic career where I write rock and pop and work with Billboard artists and produce young artists, started getting into that end of it, and now I also produce theater albums and spend a lot of time as a composer as well, working on developing 2 new Broadway shows. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and I've always been eclectic. But I do want to mention one other thing, and that is that the 3 of us are on something called the Musical Theater Task Force that we started at the New York chapter of the Recording Academy. And the Recording Academy has been a huge supporter and proponent of this, and it's to help us communicate with the theater world and the Recording Academy world and bring and help the health and integrity of that category for best Grammy for Best Musical Theater Album. So it's an important endeavor for all of us, and we're very much involved with that. So, thank you.
Amazing, thanks, Kathy. One quick question. So starting as a classical pianist and then writing pop rock and active rock songs for bands like Deutsch and Shinedown, like explain like.
Yeah, I'm like the least obvious person to do that, right? You know, sort of Jewish Italian girl from the suburbs, white middle class, you know, ending up in a room with my 2 female collaborators, actually, on all of those rock songs. And all these, you know, young rockers coming in tattooed up and down, and the 3 of us sort of looking at them, and, you know, all this testosterone in the room, and the guys are looking at us like, we want to write something really hard, and with that band, Theory of a Dead Man, we ended up writing something like really sort of touchy-feely about his relationship, and you know, actually it was actually called Love Is Hell. So, you know, it's just, for me, rock songwriting is an opportunity, and I'd say country is the other area now that allows you to do this, where you're really telling stories. And and song form still exists in a sense. You know, the more hip hop and rap oriented songs right now, which is really prevalent in pop. You know, I love listening to it, but it's not where I live as a writer. So it just ended up there. You know, our publisher had access, and the producer Howard Benson loved what we were writing, and it also seemed that the feedback we were getting from the rock world was, we really like what this is because it's a little bit left of center of what we normally hear every day from all the rock bands. So they would bring us in as outside writers to help, you know, write a single or that kind of thing.
Cool, thanks. A great song's a great song,
Yeah.
no matter the genre, right?
Right.
Kathy, we'll stay with you. Describe the day in the life.
Yikes. A day in the life of what is the question?
Like as a songwriter, as a producer, maybe your efforts with the
Okay.
Recording Academy.
Yeah, well, right now it's all busy. I find that I wear a lot of different hats, so depending on what the project is, each day is different. So if I am, let's say, as a songwriter, well, I probably, you know, it'd be more interesting maybe to this crowd. I don't know how many people we have from what areas here, but as a conductor on a show, why don't I start there? Perfect. So if a show is in production, you're basically waking up, going to rehearsal for 6 weeks, and each day is similar in that you are going to be teaching music to principals and to the company, working vocals, reworking vocals, possibly working side by side with the arrangers that are in the room, the dance arrangers and vocal arrangers, overseeing those rehearsals, interacting with the composer or composers on the show. Then maybe you get a minute for lunch. And then you do more rehearsing, and possibly you're writing underscoring, involved in rehearsals with the directors, you know, director and choreographer, the choreographers who are routining numbers, the director who is working with principals mostly, and helping to do staging and digging deep into character and what people are trying to express through the songs. So your job is to help the composer and the creatives reach their vision of what this show is supposed to look like. There are a lot of cooks in theater, and the idea is to sort of stay on track. And I think that's the hardest thing for a show to do. I'm sure Kurt can speak to that as well as we go.
Let's go, Kurt.
Day in the life, or
Yeah, I think what's interesting too is like describe the differences in your day as a publisher and then developing something like The Notebook, and where there's crossover and the A&R of that, like signing a new composer to
so-
Warner Chapel, and yeah.
So I kind of about 7 years ago I joined Warner Music Group. And Warner Music Group is a company, if you don't know, that has many different record labels, Atlantic Records, and my record label, Ghostlight, was part of that, as well as Warner Brothers Records, None Such, many, and we have a music publishing company called Warner Chapel Music Publishing. And so 7 years ago, I ran my record label at Warner, and so put out cast albums like Beetlejuice and Kimberly Akimbo and many other cast recordings at the time. And then on the Warner Chappell side, I took over for our theater writers where we would work with writers such as Alan Menken and Joe Iconis and Eddie Perfect and Shayna Taub, whose show just opened a few nights ago called Suffs. And so I take care of our theater writers in so much of their publishing. Andrew Lippa, many. Lin-Manuel Miranda, I should have remembered him. But so that's the Chappell side. But I also have been developing shows through Warner Chappell because we have a tremendous catalog of over 1 million songs, in our copyright. So I have been working with the estates of David Bowie and James Brown and other, and also our pop writers like Ross Golan and Justin Tranter. In fact, Ross Golan wrote a concept album called The Wrong Man that I turned into a musical and developed into a musical that we premiered off-Broadway right before the pandemic, starring Josh Henry at MCC. And we're still working on it. So day to day, that's kind of my day job, is kind of working with songwriters, working with artists, making records, and then if new projects come along, talking to the creators of those new projects, potentially investing in those new projects. And then the other side of my life has been developing the Notebook for the past 8 years, and that's outside of Warner Music Group. However, the cast album is released by Atlantic, so I produced the album. It came out yesterday, and then doing the Notebook. It's just developing it, workshops. Ingrid Michaelson wrote it. Michael Greif directed it. So it was a long time developing it, and the pandemic kind of got in our way. We tried it out in Chicago last year, built the team, cast it, and now it's all about selling it. And so the album will hopefully sell, help us sell, and hopefully we'll launch globally, have a tour, and run on Broadway for a long time. Knock on somebody's wood. Anyway, that's a lot, but it's what I do. So yeah.
Thanks, Kurt. David, day in the life, and then also, I know you manage a bunch of multi-genre talent, some that cross over into the Broadway space. Obviously, all your experience on Broadway. Day in the life.
Well, given this audience, I'm going to focus a little bit more on musical theater, but as Tom was mentioning, I have an artist management company, and we are fortunate to work with a bunch of Grammy-winning artists. We work with Joshua Bell, Time for Three, an R&B artist named Yeba. We work with a bunch of cool people that we haven't had from time to time, and worked with some theater people, which has been really great. But so that part of my life can take up a big chunk of time. I find, like what Kathy was saying, we wear a lot of different hats. So there's, for me, the management company, and sometimes that's all-consuming in a particular day. But then I'm also very involved in theater. Theater is something I really love, and for years as I mentioned, I had been conducting Phantom, and it's a very different experience than what you guys are doing, because you guys are developing new theater. With Phantom had been running a long time. I started with them in 1994, I think. None of you were born at that point, I'm guessing, and conducted off and on, until we closed. But because of that, the show was up and running. It's not like we were developing things, so I could go off and do other projects and come back because the show was running, and we had 3 conductors, so we could cover everything that we needed to do. And so I could go off and Kurt and I have done some albums together. We produced a couple things together. I produced a lot of cast albums. But what I've been doing a lot recently, too, on the Broadway side, is putting together orchestras, serving in a position of music coordinator. So I will work with the composers and the music staff to understand what they're looking for in musicians to perform. So, recent shows that I've done were Hadestown and Come From Away, and this recent Sweeney Todd production. So all types of things, and for me that's thrilling, because there's a chance to experience all these different kinds of music, to watch how these things get put together, and to contribute in the sense of helping them figure out how musically everything can be presented. And so for me, that's really exciting. And so I think my focus on the theater side has been more on producing records and the music coordination recently. But it's been really fun, and getting to work with both of them on the musical theater committee has been really important.
Thanks, David. All right, we're going to dive into music composition for theater. Kathy, I mean, usually you have a book, maybe it's a film before it goes to Broadway. Describe the process of writing music for theater, writing lyrics, working with the director, working with a choreographer, working with
Right.
the performers.
Right. So, so on the projects that I'm developing right now, it starts with you and your collaborators. Well, it starts a lot of different ways. Producers can commission you to write something. For me, this is something that my collaborator and I created to start with. I have a couple of different projects. One is a book that's in the public domain that we are adapting, and it's sort of, the show has become sort of inspired by that. Another is an original piece. And so there's a lot of work that goes on with thinking about what you want to present, what kind of characters you're writing for, then deciding what kind of style the music's going to have. So my expertise is as a composer, and I usually work with book writers and lyricists. So in this case, I'm going to decide what how these characters want to speak. Is it, a jazz score? Is it something I'm working on that's more American roots based? And then, you're writing. The idea then is to possibly do readings, table reads, explore that, learn what you can, then get in a room, hopefully get directors and producers on board, and then you start really exploring what that's going to feel like on stage. And you learn a lot, you rewrite as you go. I think the rule of thumb in theater is that you never stop rewriting, basically. So that's sort of where it takes you as a writer. And then you hope at some point to get it on stage. That's, and then there's out of town. There's a lot of ways to do that. Regional theater, out of town, developmental programs, that kind of thing. So.
Thanks, Kathy.
Sure.
Kurt, dive more into development. So building the talent around the copyrightable material from start
Sure.
to finish.
Sure. So I'll just take The Notebook, for example. In 2008, I saw the movie, and I was struck by how deeply emotional it was. I had relatives who'd had dementia or Alzheimer's, and I felt that the intention, I don't know, have everybody seen the movie of The Notebook? People know what that thing is? Okay, so it's about a woman who has dementia and a man who is reading a story to her to try to get her to remember their life together, to have one moment of connection, of lucidity, of something. And for me, the way I watch things, I think, oh, could this be a musical? Could this be? This thing was one of the first things that I thought that, oh, I actually see it as a musical. And so, I'd never really produced before, and I reached out to Nick Sparks's team, and they really were not interested at the time of having a musical of his work be done. And then in 2015, I partnered with a guy named Kevin McCullum, who'd produced Rent and Avenue Q and a bunch of other shows. And he and I together went back to Nick, and at that time it was like a bunch of years later, and he was like, okay. So he gave us the rights. So we got the rights. And then from there, it was like, okay, now how are we going to build our team? Kevin had a meeting. Kevin produced a show called Something Rotten, which was a show on Broadway a number of years ago. And one of the stars of Something Rotten is named Will Chase. And Will dates Ingrid Michaelson. And Ingrid was like, they were out to dinner one night, and Ingrid was like, I want to write a musical. And Kevin was like, okay, why don't we meet? And so they met, and he's like, well, I got this project, but, I just got the rights to The Notebook. And literally, she was like a cat. She was like, are you asking me to write The Notebook? And he was like, well, think about it. Just think about it. Think if it's something you want to do. And anyway, 24 hours later, Kevin called me. I was walking down 9th Avenue, and I was right next to Amy's Bread because my office was at the Film Center building at the time. And he said, I just want you to listen to something. And so I had my headphones in, and he sent me an MP3 of a song. It was called I Know, and it was Ingrid on her piano singing what is still the penultimate song of the show. It literally made me cry, like when I was walking down 9th Avenue, and I called Kevin back. I said, "This is perfect. I mean, who is this person?" And he said, "It's Ingrid Michaelson." And I was like, okay, she's never written for stage. And so I know I'm going to ask her to write another song. And so she wrote another song 24 hours later. And it's I think, third song in the show still. And so she kept writing songs and writing. And we were like, we have to hire her. So we ended up hiring Ingrid to write. And then we were introduced to a book writer named Becca Brunstetter. And Becca wrote for this TV show called This Is Us, which was a very popular show, but it also played with time in a very interesting way, and the 3 different generations. And my initial feeling about The Notebook was, because it's a musical, I wanted it to be 3 different couples. And so, for singing reasons, for memory reasons, because I think in a film it's a very literal adaptation, but theater is all about metaphor and all about suspension of disbelief, and you can do a much wider and broader scope for a musical. So Becca came on board to write the script. They wrote a first draft, and then it was about finding a director. And Kevin and I have worked with many, many different directors, and in fact, in 1995, when I was an actor, Michael Greif directed me in a musical called Faust. And so my first choice was Michael. And since then, he also directed Rent, that Kevin produced. So we met with Michael. Michael fell in love with the material, hired Michael, and then it's all about putting together a cast, writing, workshops, and all of that. So putting the team together, and then during the pandemic, Michael wanted to work and have a co-director, and we hired Shelley Williams as a co-director with him, and a choreographer named Katie Spellman. And so through that process, we, like I said earlier, we tried it out. We did a number of workshops, and then did an out-of-town tryout in Chicago. Got some pretty remarkable reviews there, and then opened on Broadway a month ago. So, it takes a long time, and the key to everything is, and even life, is like patience, and you just have to have patience, and you have to know that if you're persistent, things will happen, and they happen in the time that they do happen. But it's really about patience, and not having to rush things. And as much as we want to rush things, that's a great thing. But everything takes its own time. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kurt. So we developed the work, we built the team, we wrote the work. David, we're bringing that work to stage. Explain a bit more about that process.
Oh, sure. Well, I just want to add to what Kurt was saying for a second, in that, I've been fortunate to work on a couple of shows, Hadestown and Come From Away. And I remember when I first heard about Come From Away, I was told that this is a story about September 11th. And I thought, well, who's going to want to hear a musical about September 11th? The same thing I felt when I heard that Lin-Manuel was working on this project about a musical about Alexander Hamilton. And I'm thinking, well, what could that really be? And what you'll find in common with these kind of shows, they all had very long development periods, because there is a process to figure out what is the story that you want to tell. All the things that Kurt was just referring to take time to figure out. There's not really a successful way to rush that process, and I've been involved with some musicals that have rushed straight to Broadway, and almost all of them have tanked, because ultimately audiences can discern if there's a story that they really want to hear. And so I look at Come From Away, and I see what it turned out to be was a story that took time to develop. They did 4 out-of-town tryouts. I think after the second one, it was pretty clear it was going to be successful. They still wanted to take more time. And same thing with Hadestown. NAS had been working on it for 12 years, I think, before it came to Broadway. There was like a concept EP a long time ago. Did you do that? Were you involved in that? No, I didn't know. And then we did an off-Broadway cast album at New York Theater Workshop. And even then, after we did that, she still wanted to make some changes. And for me, watching when we did the cast album together, we would sit in a room, and she would say, that meter isn't quite right in terms of what the singer is doing. And we would move it so it would be exactly the meter that she was thinking. Everything was so specific. And I find that for those shows that are successful, usually they have that specificity. They really are thinking about everything, as opposed to big broad strokes and saying, okay, we're going to we're going to have a great set, and we're going to have a wonderful, effect that's going to really blow people away. But we've seen that happen many times where you have a wonderful staging or production, but if the story is not really well thought out, and if the music doesn't support that story, it doesn't matter how great all the trappings are. So I just wanted, it's all about the bones. And so when you get to the point of talking about bringing it to the stage, you can't really bring it to the stage until the bones are set, until things are really solidified. And so the things that you're doing when you bring it to the stage, when you do an out of town, it's a chance to like see the ideas that you've come up with. Do they work in the way you imagined? And hopefully you're tweaking. Hopefully it's not. I've been involved with shows where 1 week before we open, and it's like we need a new 11 o'clock number. And if you find that you're in that situation, you're probably not set up for success. And so I think in terms of bringing it to the stage, it's really important that you have something that you've really workshopped, that you've really thought out. Table reads, it's amazing in New York City. You have the most talented actors in the world here, and you can do table reads for very little money and learn so much. And the actors really appreciate the opportunity to be part of creating something new. So that's what I was saying in terms of when you're taking it to the stage, it's worth spending the time to really use the resources that we have here in the city to work your material.
I was just going to add one thing to that, actually. There's that famous story about funny thing happened on the way to the forum where, the idea of learning and figuring out what story you're trying to tell. And it took them forever. There were many, many, many opening numbers for that show. And finally, they landed on Comedy Tonight. And there's like, oh, that's what it's about. And so it really, you have to really get from here to there. And I think that didn't even happen until they were in previews. Is that right? Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Thank you all. Turning topics to recording music. So recording a traditional album versus recording a cast performance record. Like, explain some of the differences, the nuances, etc. Some great experience to talk about both of those things.
Well, what people don't really realize, I think, is that when you make a pop record, you're writing new songs, you're taking along. There's actually a play that opened last night called Stereophonic. If you ever want to know how to make a pop record, go see that show. So it literally talks about how you make imagine Fleetwood Mac making Rumors, and that's what that show is. It's literally takes place in a recording studio, and you're watching this band, all of their psychology. And that's how they made a pop record. I mean, I think it's a little bit different now because you don't have to be in a recording studio the entire time. But with cast albums, it's a very different experience because depending on what kind of show it is, for the most part, at least a long time ago, the unions really mandate how we make our cast albums because for every 8 hours you're in a recording studio, you have to pay the cast a week's salary. And the orchestra gets paid a session fee for every 3 hours you're in the recording studio. So many times you're making a cast album in one day and you're trying to capture lightning in a bottle. The more modern musicals now that have a lot of electronic synthesizer, those kinds of things that you can actually use a click track or you can do the orchestra first and then bring the singers on. I think the goal of making a cast album is having as much control as you possibly can for the mix. So you want to isolate as much as you can so that when you're mixing, you can tune as much as you want. You can have the ensemble in a different area, and then the orchestra, you can sonically make that as great as it can sound. But then there's been other times where I've made cast albums where it's just one giant room and you have a cast in a room and you play it down and it sounds like a big old-fashioned Broadway musical. So there's many different ways, and it really depends on from show to show. I mean, you can talk about Cinderella too and how you recorded that.
Right, no, absolutely. Cinderella is a Rodgers and Hammerstein production, and of course the music there is very orchestral. I mean, I've done that and South Pacific and King and I. Those are all very orchestral things. So much of cast recording is planning. I think I spend 95% of the time planning, thinking about how we're going to best do this, because I think one of the goals is, for an audience member, what we want to do is allow you to relive the experience of what you felt in the theater. Whether you felt, great excitement or something was incredibly romantic, we hopefully are allowing you to relive what you experienced in the theater. And if you hadn't seen the show, hopefully we're still able to convey the storytelling of that. So when we're doing production or pre-production, we're thinking about, okay, for this, it's for South Pacific or Cinderella, the orchestration is very epic. It's rich. And how do we allow that to happen? And how do we allow the music to all work together as one? So in that case, like we want to do the orchestra live all together. Some albums like Hadestown, we put the musicians in separate booths because we want the isolation of the individual instruments because we might want to affect it. We're not going to want to affect the violins in Cinderella. We're going to want it to be what it is. So we put them all in a room and create a very orchestral setting. And a lot of the albums, like you're saying, we do put the people in isolation so that we can do it. It's a very stressful day because you have to get it all done in 8 hours. The money implications, if you have a problem you didn't anticipate, could be pretty significant. So, but like for instance, Hadestown, it was very important to the creative people, to Aeneas, and to all the actors. So much of it is an interaction with people, but we wanted to also have that separation so we could do what we wanted to do in terms of post. So we decided to do something which I hadn't really done before, was put everybody kind of in a circle. We had 13 cast members and a few other people in the back that we did some ensemble fill-in. But we made sure they were all in the room, they could all see each other, but we put each of them in booths. So we created little huts for all 13 people so they could see through the plexiglass, they could work off of each other, but we had enough isolation, not complete isolation, but enough that we could work with the mix. So I think for all of us, a lot of it when we're in that experience is trying to think about what it is about the specific production that we want that will make it easiest to reflect what's happening in the show.
I like to call it the Passover question, because it's like what makes this show
night's special
different
for
from
me.
all other shows,
Yeah.
and so like for a revival of a musical, when an album has already been made, why do you need to make a new record? A lot of times you'll do it for a performer, or there'll be new orchestrations, or for example, with Pippin or Hair or something like that, there was only one record of Pippin ever before, and it was I guess made in the 70s, right? Mm-hmm. And then when the revival came out and we got to record Pippin again, Stephen Schwartz was like, I want to make the record that I know I could have made back then, but with the technology now, we can make an unbelievable album. And so even though they're the same songs, there's new vocal arrangements, it just comes to life in a different way, and you hear it completely differently. And so you ask, what makes this record different from all others? And also, if it's a new musical, how do you want it to sound sonically? With Book of Mormon, it was a very interesting story. We mixed the entire record, Bobby Lopez, Stephen Oremus, and myself and the engineer. We mixed the record the way that we wanted to hear it. And we sent it off to Matt and Trey from South Park, and they heard it, and they were like, why does it sound like a pop record? And we're like, well, isn't that what we want the music to sound like? And like, no, we want it to sound like an old-fashioned Broadway record that you would want to hear. And so we literally remixed the entire record to like make it sound like this record. But we probably should have had that conversation before we actually mixed the thing.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So it's those kind of situations.
But it's good that you had the foresight to actually do the isolation so that you could change the mix.
There you go.
Because if you hadn't, then you could be stuck.
I was going to
course.
speak to the pre-production a little bit that David was talking about, because the most important thing when you're routining a cast album is that you're trying to discern what are the things that you're going to leave out as much as what you're going to keep in. So maybe you can't do the whole dance sequence, maybe you can't do some of that dialogue. But I think that a friend of mine said to me once, I want to know what the story is if I've never seen the show. If I'm sitting in a town somewhere in Iowa and I've never been to Broadway, but I discover Sweeney Todd, for example, I want to feel like I'm on stage with that performance the whole time and really understand the story from beginning to end. So that's part of the routining process. And the other thing that I think is different with pop albums and theater albums has to do with arrangements and orchestration. So in theater, there are dance arrangers and vocal arrangers and orchestrators who are often taking the composer's score and expanding it, making it sound like, giving it color, giving it shape, right? It's all done ahead of time, and the cast is well rehearsed, and they've been maybe rehearsing and performing the show for weeks or probably weeks or maybe months by the time the show opens and by the time the album is recorded. So they come in, they know exactly what they're doing that day. It's often one take, maybe it's 2 takes, maybe it's 3, but there's not really more time than that. In the pop world, and I use that as a broad term, rock, R&B, country, everything is a little different in each genre, but the one thing that is pretty consistent these days is that whether you have live musicians or synthetic digital track working, there's a lot of arranging on the spot. So in country music, you know, the top session players in Nashville show up and they are in a studio and they're given a lead sheet basically, and they're told like this, sound like this artist, sound like this vibe. In pop music, it's more like you sit in a room and you get up a groove, and then you add, and there are a couple of writers in the room, and maybe the artist is in the room, and you're trying to come up with a vibe, and a little bit more of this sort of melody line here, and a little bit more of this sort of drum part here. So it changes as you go. And then there's a lot of going home and that's not right, let's do it again. Or then we lay a vocal, then we go back and we think about it, then we comp a vocal, then we do 49 tracks of that vocal and we comp that vocal. So it's a very different process in that sense. Again, it depends on budgets and who the artist is, how big is that artist. Is it a wham bam, thank you ma'am kind of procedure or not? But those are some of the differences in my experience.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I've had the fortune of doing a couple of jazz albums. I did this album with Long, he's not a jazz artist, of course, and Herbie Hancock. They were doing a duo version of Rhapsody in Blue. And, you know, in the parts that were orchestrated as written, you could comp those things, meaning put different takes together, and it would line up no problem. But when Herbie would do his cadenzas and his solos, you couldn't like comp his solos together because every time it was completely different. So in the process, like with a cast album, it's so well rehearsed that every take is essentially musically the same. It's just about what performance and you line it up. But when you're doing a jazz album, every take is different, and there's not always a way to line things up. So the process is definitely very different between a cast album and doing other genres.
Thank you all. Open up the floor for Q&A. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I think
She has
there's
a mic. 1 second.
Hello. See? Hello. Hey, thank you guys for being here. I am a music composer, but I've also just started my MBA, so I have kind of two, you know, I'm on a fence here, and I wanted to ask you a question about technology and specifically AI, because I think as a composer, we want to protect our works and our creativity. However, in the business world and just the world in general, so many people are pushing, well, you have to embrace AI if you want to survive. You have to, take it all in and learn and learn and learn. So here's the question, how do creatives, how should we be looking at this big scary thing that is AI and also protect the creativity and the individuality of creative works?
Thank you. Who wants to start?
I'll say
ahead.
something.
Go.
I think theater's one of the most beautiful art forms because it takes live people and live musicians and an audience to create it. I think that you can use AI through marketing slogans, through when you're building a set and there's certain backdrops, or you're building decks, or to help you tell the story of what you're trying to do. But they're more tools, I think, than creations or original creations. But they're tools to be able to, at least at this point, not take away the human experience, but that allow you to maybe do it faster, maybe do things differently, maybe think about things differently. But but as far as it taking away from you as a songwriter or a composer, I don't think that that's going to change. And the human experience of theater, I mean, it's, you know, AI is not going to, I mean, they may write a musical, or it may write a musical. I shouldn't even say that. It's not even a person. It may write a musical, but that musical is not going to have the human touch, you know, because it takes people to create it. You know, you can't, AI is not going to direct the musical. AI is not going to act in the musical. And AI certainly isn't going to be the one to build the set with, you know, so it's, you know, maybe machines will, but who knows? You got to have designers, you got to have all the creatives do it, and it's human. It's human.
I mean, I would say that certainly over the years, you know, there's been technology has always been, when there's new technology, people have the same concern that you're mentioning now. I remember when synthesizers started coming into play, people were worried that that was going to eliminate orchestras completely. And certainly there have been bumps in the road in terms of figuring out how to incorporate synths in a way that would add to the artistic nature of what we do. And you know, we worked through that, and we have found a way now where the synthesizers are adding in a different color, not necessarily replacing people. But there's always going to be challenges that technology presents. But I think, you know, for the things that we're doing that are artistic related, I don't believe you're ever going to have a machine be able to bring passion and heart, the emotions that human beings feel. And I think that's where, hopefully, what we all do is still going to be essential and not be able to be replaced.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly that I think the value of being a creative, it's something that we have to hold up to a high standard. And that's also something that we have to work at every day. And it's great that these tools are here to access them once in a while, but I personally want to maintain the vigilance to sort of work my own brain and my own level of creativity. Yes, we get inspired by all kinds of things, but I don't want to use it as a crutch ever. And I want to just sort of hold myself to an incredibly high standard. So I think that's sort of part of my personal journey that way.
But get your MBA.
Thank you. One more question. One second, we're grabbing the mic here.
Hi, thank you for joining us. My name's Alana. Nice to meet you guys. This question is more specific. I think Kurt would have the most experience with this since I heard your background and I specifically thought of this question. I'm a huge Broadway fan, and I was wondering which opportunities do you think are going to be on the way with the rise of like jukebox musicals and how you work with catalog music? And another thing, since you say you work with Ghostlight Records, I'm curious how it worked bringing Be More Chill back to Broadway from the catalog after it had the huge explosion in popularity 2 years after being off Broadway, only having a recording, and Iconis' team generally didn't have an eye on it until it was coming back.
Okay, so let's start with Be More Chill, because I can only remember so many things so fast. But Be More Chill. So I saw the show in New Jersey when it performed in New Jersey, and I've worked with Joe before. I decided at that time with the theater that we would record the cast album from New Jersey, and we recorded that recording. And it didn't get a good review in the New York Times, and so they didn't move it to New York. But the album was out there. And I think that there's this analogy that is like, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to see it, did it really fall kind of thing? And so with musicals, if you don't record a cast album, it's like it never really existed. So with Be More Chill, it was about a year after we recorded it, and all of a sudden we started seeing virally on YouTube or I don't know if TikTok was around at the time, but we started seeing many people doing fan art and many people responding to the Michael in the Bathroom song and doing their own versions of Michael in the Bathroom. And so we at Ghostlight really pumped the volume to promote it even more until it got millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of streams. And so it went viral as a cast album. And the same thing happened with Beetlejuice too. But Be More Chill and specifically, so when it went viral, the producers who ended up producing the show of Be More Chill off Broadway found that because of the virality, there was the opportunity to bring it to New York and do it off Broadway. Sold out in 9 weeks off Broadway and just was great. And then they said, well, why don't we do a Broadway production of it? And so that's where it didn't necessarily catch on the way that they thought it was going to catch on. It was for a very specific audience, I think, for not necessarily the $150 ticket audience. But it's had a tremendous life in licensing, and also it played in London at the Other Palace for a long time. So that was a great thing for the show. And now that there are 2 albums that are out there, people can listen to both albums and they can perform it. You know it. A lot of people know it, and high schools and colleges and young theater companies can do it. With respect to jukebox musicals, I think there's a few different kinds. You have your Mamma Mias, or your Anne Juliettes, or your Moulin Rouges, which are more a story with popular songs in them. And then you have bio musicals, which are like Jersey Boys, or Beautiful, or the Neil Diamond musical, which are Tina or Cher, which are really about, and or MJ, which are really about artists' life using those music. So that's not really, I wouldn't call that a jukebox musical, I'd call that a bio musical. And so, you know, both are valid and both have incredible stories. If there's a dramatic story to tell about a person's life, Tina had a very, very interesting life, and there's a very, very important story, I think, to tell about how a woman came from this, was abused, and then rose to become an icon that she was. Jersey Boys, same thing. Nobody really knew the Four Seasons, and I thought that it was brilliantly written. Same with Beautiful. Perfect target audience for Broadway, you know, about Carole King, about the songwriters, and who buys tickets to Broadway shows? Women buy tickets to Broadway shows. And that target audience at the time was great. So when I work with catalogs right now, I think about, okay, does this person warrant a bio-musical? Or is there a catalog of songs that we can make a new Mamma Mia, or make a new Anne Juliet, or find a film that would fit with these kind of songs? I think those are the differences, and that's kind of what I do, is like, okay, and then also, how can you make it different, and how can you make it interesting, and how can you think it's cool? How can you think a show about, you know, David Bowie is cool, or this person is cool, and so it can reach as wide of an audience as possible.